Welcome, friends, to a peaceful hour where we'll gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes us to a world far removed from our own, but one that is still deeply, tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow down the pace of your evening, I'm so grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Tell me what city, what country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this calm, historical storytelling brings you a sense of peace, please consider subscribing. We have many more stories to help us all drift into the quiet of the night. But first, let me give you some context about just how truly insane these journeys really were. The Vikings weren't just sailing around their local fjords for a few hours. These guys were absolute madmen, crossing entire oceans in boats that were, for all intents and purposes, oversized canoes. They sailed from Scandinavia to places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, traveling thousands of miles in vessels that a modern sailor wouldn't trust to cross a small lake. And they did all of this without GPS, without weather forecasting, and without any of the safety equipment we consider essential today, the average. Viking Longship was only about 60 to 70 feet long and 15 feet wide. To put that in perspective, that's smaller than most modern recreational boats. Yet they crammed 30 to 60 people into that tiny space for journeys that could last weeks or even months. Imagine being trapped in a space the size of a small apartment with 60 other people, with zero privacy, zero comfort, and no escape. These ships were designed for one thing: speed and maneuverability in battle. They were not designed for comfort or long-term habitation. The shallow hull made them incredibly fast, but it also meant they were completely at the mercy of the waves and the weather. There was no real shelter except for a small tent-like structure that might protect a few people. Most of the crew was completely exposed to the elements. Now, you might be thinking, surely these tough Viking warriors could handle a little discomfort, right? Well, you're about to discover that what they endured goes far beyond simple discomfort. We're talking about conditions so harsh that they would break most modern people within a few days. Let's start with the most basic human need: space to exist. On a Viking longship, personal space was a luxury that simply didn't exist. Each man had roughly 6 feet of space to call his own. And this wasn't just a sleeping area. This was his entire world for the duration of the voyage. He would eat, sleep, work, and relieve himself within this tiny allocated space. The sleeping arrangements were particularly brutal. There were no beds, no mattresses, and no pillows. Vikings slept on the hard wooden deck, maybe with a thin piece of cloth or an animal hide if they were lucky. During storms, they couldn't even lie down properly because they needed to constantly bail water or adjust the sail. Many Vikings would sleep sitting up, leaning against their sea chest or the side of the boat, trying to find any position that would give them a few hours of rest. But even when they could lie down, sleep was often impossible. The constant motion of the boat, the noise of creaking wood and crashing waves, and the proximity of so many other people made rest a rare luxury. Add to this the fact that someone always needed to be on watch, steering the ship or looking out for dangers, and you start to understand why. Vikings often arrived at their destinations already exhausted. Even before any fighting began, the lack of privacy was psychologically devastating. Imagine trying to maintain any sense of dignity or personal space when you're surrounded by dozens of other men 24 hours a day for weeks on end. There was nowhere to go for a moment of solitude, nowhere to escape the constant presence of others. This psychological pressure alone was enough to drive some men to madness. But the cramped conditions were just the beginning of their problems. The smell inside a Viking longship was absolutely revolting. With 30 to 60 unwashed men confined in a small space, the stench was overwhelming. These weren't people who bathed regularly, even on land and on a ship. There was virtually no opportunity for personal hygiene. Vikings would go for weeks without changing their clothes or washing their bodies. Their wool and leather garments would become soaked with salt water, sweat, and worse, and then never properly dry. The combination of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and poor ventilation created a smell so powerful that it could be detected from miles away. Enemy ships could literally smell a Viking longship approaching before they could see it. The situation with human waste was particularly horrific. There were no toilets, no privacy, and no proper sanitation. Vikings had to relieve themselves over the side of the boat, which was dangerous during storms and impossible during rough weather. When the weather was bad, they had no choice but to use buckets or designated areas of the ship, which then needed to be cleaned out when conditions improved. The smell of human waste mixed with the already overwhelming body odor created an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Many Vikings would tie cloth around their faces to try to filter the air, but there was no escaping the stench. New crew members would often spend their first days constantly vomiting, not just from seasickness, but from the overwhelming smell. Food storage added another layer to this olfactory nightmare. Vikings carried salted meat, dried fish, and other preserved foods that had their own strong odor. These foods would often spoil during long voyages, adding the smell of rotting meat to the already toxic atmosphere. The combination of all these odors created a miasma so thick and nauseating that it's hard for modern people to even imagine. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the smell was how it clung to everything. The Vikings' clothes, hair, skin, and equipment would absorb these odors so completely that they would carry the stench with them long after leaving the ship. Even after returning to land and bathing, the smell would linger for weeks. The psychological impact of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. The constant assault on the senses, combined with the physical discomfort and lack of privacy, created a level of stress that pushed many Vikings to their breaking point. Fights would break out over the smallest issues. Friendships would be destroyed, and the social bonds that held Viking society together would be tested to their limits. Yet somehow these men endured. They found ways to cope with conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. They developed techniques for sleeping in impossible positions, methods for maintaining some semblance of hygiene, and mental strategies for dealing with the psychological pressure of their floating prison. The Vikings who survived these voyages were forever changed by the experience. They returned home hardened not just by battle, but by the brutal ordeal of simply surviving the journey itself. The Longship voyage was like a crucible that forged ordinary men into the legendary warriors we remember today, but the cramped, stinking conditions were just one aspect of the nightmare. The daily routine aboard a Viking longship was a relentless cycle of backbreaking labor that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Every single day was a battle against exhaustion, and there was no rest for anyone. The most grueling aspect of daily life was rowing. Viking longships were powered primarily by human muscle, and when the wind wasn't favorable, every able-bodied man had to take his turn at the oars. These weren't the lightweight oars you might find on a recreational boat. Viking oars were massive, heavy pieces of wood that required tremendous strength to operate effectively. A typical rowing shift lasted between 4 to 6 hours, and during this time, the rowers had to maintain a steady, powerful rhythm. The work was so intense that men's hands would blister and bleed within the first few days of a voyage. The constant friction from gripping the rough wooden oar handles would tear away skin, leaving raw, open wounds that would never properly heal during the journey. The physical demands were extraordinary. Rowing required not just arm strength, but the coordinated effort of the entire body. Vikings had to engage their legs, core, back, and arms in perfect synchronization, all while maintaining the precise timing necessary to keep the ship moving efficiently. A single rower falling out of rhythm could throw off the entire crew and slow the ship's progress, but the rowing was just the beginning of their daily labor. During storms or rough weather, every man on board became part of the crew responsible for keeping the ship afloat. This meant constantly bailing water that crashed over the sides or leaked through the hull. Viking longships were not watertight vessels. They were designed for speed and flexibility, which meant they constantly took on water during rough seas. Bailing water was a never-ending task that required Vikings to use buckets, bowls, or even their helmets to scoop water out of the ship and throw it overboard. During severe storms, this became a matter of life and death. If the crew couldn't bail water fast enough, the ship would sink, taking everyone down with it. Men would work for hours without rest, their arms burning with exhaustion, knowing that stopping meant death for everyone on board. The sail management was another brutal aspect of daily life that demanded constant attention and incredible physical strength. Viking sails were enormous pieces of wool cloth that could weigh hundreds of pounds when wet. Raising, lowering, and adjusting these massive sails required the coordinated effort of multiple men working in perfect harmony. When the wind changed direction, which happened frequently during ocean voyages, the entire crew had to spring into action to adjust the sail. This wasn't a simple matter of pulling a rope. The sail had to be completely repositioned, which meant untying heavy ropes, hauling the massive sail to a new position, and then securing it again with knots that could withstand hurricane-force winds. During storms, managing the sail became a life or death struggle. Vikings had to work on a pitching, rolling deck that was constantly being swept by waves, trying to control a sail that was being whipped around by winds strong enough to knock a man overboard. Many Vikings were injured or killed during these sail operations, either by being struck by the heavy wooden boom or by being swept overboard. While trying to secure loose rigging, the physical toll of these daily tasks was devastating. Within days of beginning a voyage, every Viking's body would be screaming in pain. Their hands would be raw and bleeding from rope burns and splinters. Their backs would ache from the constant bending and lifting. Their arms and shoulders would burn with a pain that never went away, no matter how much rest they managed to get, but rest was a luxury that rarely came. Even when a Viking wasn't actively rowing or working the sail, there were dozens of other tasks that needed constant attention. The ship's hull had to be inspected regularly for damage. Loose boards had to be resecured. Equipment had to be maintained and repaired. Food and water supplies had to be managed and distributed. Navigation was another constant concern that required the attention of the most experienced crew members. Vikings navigated using the position of the sun and stars, the behavior of birds, the color and temperature of the water, and their knowledge of ocean currents. This required constant observation and calculation with no room for error. A mistake in navigation could mean sailing into a storm, running aground on hidden rocks, or becoming completely lost in the vast ocean. The psychological pressure of this constant work was enormous. There was no 8-hour workday, no weekends, no vacation time. Every moment of every day required vigilance and effort. Vikings had to maintain this level of intensity for weeks or even months, knowing that any lapse in attention or effort could result in disaster for the entire crew. Watch system added another layer of exhaustion to their already brutal routine. Someone always had to be awake and alert, watching for dangers, monitoring the weather, and steering the ship. This meant that sleep was broken into short, interrupted periods. A Viking might get 3 or 4 hours of rest only to be woken up for his watch duty, then have to row for 6 hours. then maybe get another hour or two of sleep before being called to adjust the sail. This constant sleep deprivation had serious effects on both physical and mental health. Vikings would become clumsy and accident-prone, making mistakes that could endanger the entire crew. They would become irritable and prone to violent outbursts. Over minor disagreements, some would begin to hallucinate from exhaustion, seeing things that weren't there or hearing voices in the wind and waves. The food situation made everything worse. Vikings carried preserved foods that were designed to last for long voyages, but these were hardly appetizing or nutritious. Their diet consisted mainly of dried fish, salted meat, hard biscuits, and ale or water. Fresh food was impossible to preserve for long periods, so Vikings would go weeks without eating anything that wasn't dried, salted, or fermented. The dried fish was particularly unpleasant. It was hard as a rock and had to be soaked in water or ale to make it edible. Even then, it was tough, salty, and often infested with insects or maggots. The salted meat wasn't much better, often becoming rancid during long voyages and developing a taste that would make most modern people vomit. Water was always a critical concern. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed, and it often became stagnant and foul-tasting during long voyages. Vikings would sometimes resort to drinking seawater mixed with ale, which would make them sick but was better than dying of thirst. The lack of fresh water also meant that cooking was limited, so most food was eaten cold and unappetizing. The limited diet led to serious nutritional deficiencies. Vikings would develop scurvy from a lack of vitamin C, causing their teeth to fall out and their gums to bleed. They would suffer from various other deficiency diseases that would weaken their immune systems and make them susceptible to infections and illnesses. Mealtimes provided no relief from the harsh conditions. Vikings ate while sitting on the hard deck, often in rough weather with waves crashing over the sides. Food would be contaminated with salt water, and eating became more about survival than any kind of pleasure. Many Vikings would lose significant weight during long voyages, arriving at their destinations gaunt and weakened. The psychological impact of this poor nutrition, combined with the physical exhaustion, created a perfect storm of misery. Hungry, tired men trapped in a small space with no privacy and no comfort became increasingly volatile and unpredictable. The legendary Viking berserkers may have been as much a product of these brutal conditions as they were of any warrior culture. Through all of this daily torture, Vikings had to maintain their equipment and weapons. Their lives depended on keeping their axes, swords, and shields in perfect condition. But the salt water and constant moisture made this nearly impossible. Metal would rust within days, if not constantly maintained. Leather would rot and fall apart. Wood would warp and crack. Vikings spent what little free time they had trying to preserve their gear, rubbing oil into leather, sharpening blades, and replacing broken handles. This maintenance was crucial because they knew that when they reached their destination, they would likely have to fight, and their survival would depend on having functional weapons and armor. The constant threat of equipment failure added another layer of stress to their already overwhelming daily routine. A broken oar could slow the entire ship. A torn sail could leave them stranded in the middle of the ocean. A damaged hull could sink the ship and kill everyone on board. Every piece of equipment had to be constantly monitored and maintained, adding to the endless list of tasks that had to be completed every single day. This constant maintenance became a matter of life and death because equipment failure in the middle of the ocean meant certain doom. Vikings developed an almost obsessive relationship with their tools and weapons, checking them multiple times per day because they understood that their survival depended entirely on these pieces of wood, metal, and leather functioning perfectly when they were needed most. But perhaps nothing was more terrifying than the weather itself. which could transform their already miserable existence into a genuine fight for survival in a matter of minutes. Viking longships were at the complete mercy of nature's fury, and when storms hit, these vessels became floating coffins where death lurked around every crashing wave. The North Atlantic is one of the most treacherous bodies of water on Earth, known for sudden, violent storms that can appear without warning. Modern ships with steel hulls, advanced weather prediction, and sophisticated navigation systems still struggle with these waters. The Vikings faced them in wooden boats with nothing but their experience and raw determination. When a storm began brewing, the atmosphere on board would change dramatically. Experienced Vikings could read the signs in the color of the water, the behavior of seabirds, and the feel of the wind. They knew that their lives were about to be put to the ultimate test, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to avoid what was coming. The first sign of an approaching storm was usually a change in the waves. What had been relatively calm seas would begin to show whitecaps and longer swells. The wind would shift direction and pick up strength. The air itself would feel different, charged with an electricity that made every Viking's skin crawl in anticipation of the horror to come as the storm intensified. Waves that had been manageable would grow into towering walls of water that dwarfed their tiny vessel. These weren't the gentle rolling waves you might see at a beach. These were massive, angry mountains of water that could reach heights of 30, 40, or even 50 feet. To put that in perspective, imagine standing next to a 5-story building. Then imagine that building made of water crashing down on top of you. The longship would be tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. One moment, the crew would be looking up at a wall of water so high they couldn't see the top. The next moment, they would be sliding down the back of a wave into a trough so deep that the storm clouds seemed to disappear above them. The sensation was like being inside a washing machine, operated by an angry god. During these storms, every single person on board had to fight for their lives. There was no safe place to hide, no shelter that could protect them from the fury of the ocean. Waves would crash over the sides of the ship with such force that they could knock a grown man unconscious or sweep him overboard to his death. Vikings had to lash themselves to the ship with ropes to avoid being thrown into the churning sea. The noise during a storm was absolutely deafening. The wind would howl like a living thing, creating a sound so loud that Vikings couldn't hear each other shouting from just a few feet away. The waves would crash against the hull with the force of thunder, creating booms that could be felt in every bone of their bodies. The ship itself would creak and groan as the wooden hull flexed and twisted under the immense pressure, creating sounds that suggested the vessel was about to break apart at any moment. Water would pour over the sides faster than the crew could bail it out. Vikings would form human chains, passing buckets of water from hand to hand in a desperate attempt to keep the ship afloat. But during the worst storms, they would be fighting a losing battle. Water would accumulate in the bottom of the ship faster than they could remove it, and they would know that they were slowly sinking. The physical demands during this storm were beyond human endurance, yet Vikings had no choice but to endure them anyway. They had to maintain their footing on a deck that was constantly pitching and rolling at impossible angles. They had to work with equipment that was slippery with seawater and nearly impossible to grip. They had to perform complex tasks while being battered by winds strong, enough to knock them down and waves powerful enough to break their bones. Many Vikings were seriously injured during storms. They would be thrown against the sides of the ship, breaking ribs and arms. They would be struck by loose equipment that became deadly projectiles in the chaos. Some would be partially swept overboard, saved only by the ropes that bound them to the ship, but left with injuries that would never properly heal. The psychological terror of these storms was perhaps even worse than the physical danger. Vikings were brave warriors who feared little in battle, But storms reduced them to helpless children at the mercy of forces beyond their comprehension or control. They would pray to their gods, make bargains with the spirits of the sea, and prepare themselves for death while continuing to fight for survival. The darkness during night storms was particularly horrifying. Vikings would be surrounded by a blackness so complete that they couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They would hear the roar of approaching waves, but have no idea which direction they were coming from or how large they were. The ship would suddenly lurch violently, and they would know that another massive wave had hit them, but they couldn't see what was happening or prepare for the next impact. Lightning during storms created moments of stark, terrifying clarity. For brief instances, the entire scene would be illuminated in harsh white light, revealing the true magnitude of the waves surrounding them and the desperate faces of their companions. Then the darkness would return, leaving them blind once again, but with the horrible knowledge of just how close to death they really were. Some storms would last for days, testing human endurance beyond any reasonable limit. Vikings would go without sleep, without food, without rest, battling constantly just to keep their ship afloat. They would work until their bodies gave out, then somehow find the strength to continue working. Men would collapse from exhaustion, only to be revived by a wave crashing over them, forcing them back into the fight for survival. The cold during storms made everything exponentially worse. The North Atlantic is frigid even during summer, and storm winds would drive the temperature down to levels that could kill through hypothermia. Vikings would be soaked to the skin with ice-cold seawater with no way to get warm or dry. Their clothes would freeze to their bodies, and their hands would become so numb that they could barely grip the ropes and tools they needed to survive. Frostbite was a constant danger during winter storms. Vikings would lose fingers and toes to the cold, and some would die from hypothermia even if the ship survived the storm. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and terror would push many men beyond their breaking point, and some would simply give, accepting death rather than continuing to fight against impossible odds. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of storms was the complete helplessness they imposed. Vikings were proud, independent warriors who were accustomed to controlling their own destiny through strength and skill. Storms stripped all of that away, reducing them to frightened passengers on a vessel that was completely at the mercy of natural forces they couldn't understand or influence. During the worst storms, Vikings would genuinely believe they were going to die. They would say goodbye to each other, share their final thoughts, and prepare to meet their gods. The fact that they often survived these experiences only added to their reputation as warriors touched by divine favor. But the psychological scars of these near-death experiences would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When storms finally passed, the aftermath was often almost as brutal as the storm itself. The ship would be damaged with broken oars, torn sails, and loose planking that needed immediate repair. Equipment would be lost or damaged beyond use. Some crew members would be injured or, in the worst cases, missing entirely, swept overboard during the chaos. The exhaustion following a major storm was unlike anything most people have ever experienced. Vikings would have been fighting for their lives for hours or days without rest, food, or water. Their bodies would be battered and bruised, their hands torn and bleeding, their muscles screaming with fatigue. Yet, they would still have to continue sailing, often with damaged equipment and a reduced crew. Because stopping in the middle of the ocean meant certain death, recovery from storms could take days or weeks, assuming the ship and crew survived intact. Vikings would have to jury-rig repairs using whatever materials they had on board. They would have to redistribute duties to account for injured or missing crew members. They would have to ration their remaining supplies more carefully if stores had been lost or contaminated during the storm. The psychological impact of surviving these storms was profound. Vikings who lived through multiple severe storms developed a fatalistic attitude toward life and death that influenced their entire worldview. They understood viscerally that death could come at any moment without warning, and that survival often depended more on luck than on skill or courage. This constant exposure to mortal danger created the legendary Viking fearlessness in battle. Men who had faced down storms that could sink mountains were not easily intimidated by human enemies. They had already looked death in the face multiple times and survived, giving them a confidence and recklessness that made them formidable warriors. Yet, the weather wasn't just dangerous during storms. Even calm weather presented its own unique challenges that could slowly kill Vikings through exposure, dehydration, and despair. Becalmed ships could drift for weeks without wind, leaving crews stranded in the middle of the ocean with dwindling supplies and no way to reach land. During these calm periods, the sun would beat down mercilessly on Vikings who had no shelter. From its rays, the wooden deck would become so hot that it burned their feet through their boots. The lack of wind meant no relief from the stifling heat, and dehydration became a serious threat. Vikings would ration their water so carefully that they were constantly thirsty, their lips cracked and bleeding, their throats parched and painful. The psychological torture of being becalmed was arguably worse than storms. During storms, Vikings could at least feel like they were fighting for their survival. During calm periods, they could only sit and wait, watching their supplies dwindle, while scanning the horizon for any sign of wind or land. The helplessness was maddening, and many Vikings would begin to show signs of mental breakdown after days or weeks of drifting aimlessly. But the weather was just one enemy these Vikings faced on their floating prisons. Disease and injury were constant companions that turned every minor cut into a potential death sentence. Without any medical knowledge beyond basic battlefield treatment, Vikings watched helplessly as their companions died from infections that would be easily treatable today. The cramped, unsanitary conditions aboard Viking longships created the perfect breeding ground for disease. With no understanding of germs or hygiene, Vikings unknowingly created environments where deadly illnesses could spread like wildfire through the entire crew. A single sick person could infect everyone on board within days, turning the ship into a floating plague vessel. Dysentery was one of the most common and deadly diseases that plagued Viking voyages. The combination of contaminated food, polluted water, and poor sanitation created ideal conditions for this devastating illness. Vikings would suffer from severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, quickly becoming too weak to perform their duties. In the confined space of a longship, the disease would spread rapidly from person to person. The symptoms of dysentery were particularly brutal in the context of shipboard life. Vikings suffering from the disease would lose control of their bowels, creating an even more horrific sanitary situation than already existed. The smell would become unbearable, and healthy crew members would be forced to clean up after their sick companions while trying not to become infected themselves. Dehydration from dysentery was often fatal because Vikings had limited fresh water supplies that couldn't be wasted on trying to keep sick men hydrated. Crew members would watch their friends waste away, becoming skeletal shadows of their former selves before finally dying in agony. The bodies would have to be thrown overboard, often while still barely alive, because there was no way to properly care for the dying in such conditions. Scurvy was another constant threat that slowly destroyed Vikings from the inside out. This disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C, would begin with seemingly minor symptoms like fatigue and joint pain. But as voyages stretched on for weeks or months, the effects became increasingly horrific. Vikings' teeth would loosen and fall out. Their gums would bleed constantly, and old wounds would reopen as their bodies lost the ability to heal properly. The psychological impact of watching your own body deteriorate from scurvy was devastating. Vikings would feel their strength leaving them day by day, knowing that they were slowly dying, but powerless to stop it. Their skin would develop a sickly pallor, and dark spots would appear all over their bodies. Some would become so weak that they couldn't even lift an oar, making them useless dead weight that the crew had to carry. Advanced scurvy would cause internal bleeding that Vikings couldn't understand or treat. They would cough up blood, develop massive bruises from minor bumps, and experience excruciating pain in their joints and muscles. The disease would eventually kill them, but not before weeks or months of progressive suffering that demoralized the entire crew. Infections from minor wounds were perhaps the most frustrating cause of death because they seemed so preventable. A small cut from a splinter or rope burn could become infected in the dirty, wet conditions of the ship. Without antibiotics or proper wound care, these infections would spread through the bloodstream, causing fever, delirium, and eventual death. Vikings would watch in horror as a tiny scratch on a companion's hand would gradually turn red, then black, then begin to smell of rot and decay. The infected area would swell to enormous proportions, filled with pus and dead tissue. Eventually, the infection would spread throughout the body, causing the victim to develop a high fever and begin speaking nonsense before finally dying in agony. Blood poisoning from infected wounds was particularly terrifying because it could kill a strong, healthy Viking within days. The victim would develop red streaks running up their arm or leg from the infected wound, and everyone knew this was a death sentence. There was nothing they could do except watch their companion die, knowing that any of them could be next if they suffered even a minor injury. Broken bones were another serious threat because they almost never healed properly. In shipboard conditions, a Viking who broke his arm or leg during a storm would be crippled for life, assuming he survived the voyage at all. Without proper splinting or medical care, bones would heal croaked or not at all, leaving the victim permanently disabled and unable to fight or work effectively. The constant dampness and cold made bone injuries even more problematic. Vikings with broken bones would experience constant pain that intensified during storms or cold weather. Many would develop infections in the broken bone itself, leading to a slow, agonizing death as the infection spread throughout their body. Hypothermia was a constant danger that could kill Vikings even during relatively mild weather. The combination of wet clothes, cold winds, and lack of shelter meant that body temperature could drop to dangerous levels without warning. Vikings suffering from hypothermia would become confused and disoriented, making poor decisions that could endanger the entire crew. The early stages of hypothermia were particularly dangerous because Vikings might not realize what was happening to them. They would begin to shiver uncontrollably, but this was so common in the cold conditions that it didn't seem alarming. As their condition worsened, they would become clumsy and slow, making mistakes that could damage equipment or injure other crew members. Advanced hypothermia would cause Vikings to become irrational and even remove their clothes, thinking they were hot when they were actually freezing to death. This paradoxical undressing was often the last thing a Viking would do before dying, leaving his companions confused and horrified by his apparently senseless behavior. Drowning was an ever-present threat that could claim Vikings even when they were safely aboard the ship. During storms, waves would crash over the sides with such force that they could pin a man underwater, even though he was still technically on deck. Vikings who couldn't swim, which was most of them, would panic and thrash around, often making their situation worse. The irony of drowning while aboard a ship was not lost on Vikings, who understood that the ocean could kill them in countless different ways. They developed a healthy respect for the sea that bordered on superstition, creating elaborate rituals and offerings designed to appease the spirits they believed controlled the waters. Many Vikings who fell overboard were never recovered, even if they fell during calm weather. The ship couldn't easily turn around to search for a missing man, and without life preservers or rescue equipment, anyone who went into the water was essentially doomed. Crews would watch helplessly as their companions disappeared beneath the waves, knowing there was nothing they could do to help. The psychological trauma of watching friends die from disease and injury was perhaps as damaging as the physical threats themselves. Vikings were warriors who expected to die in battle with weapons in their hands, earning their place in Valhalla through glorious combat. Dying slowly from disease or drowning in the ocean offered no glory, no honor, and no hope of a warrior's afterlife. This constant exposure to senseless death created a fatalistic attitude among Viking crews that affected every aspect of their behavior. They would make dark jokes about death, develop superstitions about everything from the color of the water to the behavior of seabirds, and form intense bonds with their surviving companions that were forged in shared suffering. The lack of medical knowledge meant that Vikings often tried desperate remedies that were more likely to kill than cure. They would attempt to treat infections by cauterizing wounds with hot metal, often causing more damage than the original injury. They would try to cure scurvy by drinking urine or eating leather, not understanding that these treatments were useless at best and harmful at worst. Some Vikings would resort to amputation when infections threatened to spread, using crude tools and no anesthesia to hack off infected limbs. Most patients died from shock or blood loss during these procedures, but it was considered preferable to certain death from spreading infection. The screams of men undergoing these primitive surgeries would haunt the dreams of everyone aboard. Religious rituals became increasingly important as death stalked the ship. Vikings would make offerings to the sea gods, perform elaborate ceremonies to ward off evil spirits, and pray constantly to their pantheon of deities for protection. These rituals provided some psychological comfort, but did nothing to address the real medical problems that were killing them. The disposal of bodies presented its own challenges and psychological trauma. Dead Vikings had to be thrown overboard immediately to prevent the spread of disease, but this meant that many warriors never received proper burial rites. Their companions would have to watch their friends disappear beneath the waves, knowing they would never be properly honored or remembered. Some Vikings would try to preserve bodies for proper burial once they reached land, but this was usually impossible in the warm, humid conditions of the ship's interior. Bodies would decompose rapidly, creating an unbearable stench and attracting rats and other vermin that would spread disease to the living crew members. The constant presence of death changed Vikings in fundamental ways. Men who survived multiple voyages would develop a hardened indifference to suffering that served them well in battle, but made them seem callous and cruel to outsiders. They learned to compartmentalize their emotions, pushing aside grief and fear, to focus on the immediate tasks necessary for survival. Yet, despite all these medical horrors, Vikings continued to undertake these voyages, driven by a combination of economic necessity, cultural expectations, and pure stubborn determination. They understood the risks, but considered them acceptable prices to pay for the wealth and glory that successful raids could bring. The survivors of these medical nightmares would return home as changed men, carrying physical scars and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Many would suffer from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt that made it difficult to readjust to normal life on land. But the medical threats were only part of the horror that awaited Vikings on their ocean voyages. The constant threat of starvation loomed over every expedition, turning mealtimes into grim calculations of survival odds rather than opportunities for nourishment and fellowship. Food management. Aboard a Viking Longship was a matter of life and death that required careful planning and ruthless discipline. Vikings had to carry enough provisions to sustain 30 to 60 men for weeks or months, but storage space was extremely limited and preservation methods were primitive at best. Every pound of food had to be carefully calculated against the available space and the expected duration of the voyage. The staple foods carried on. Viking voyages were designed for longevity rather than taste or nutrition. Dried fish formed the backbone of their diet. But this wasn't the carefully prepared dried fish we might buy today. Viking dried fish was often poorly preserved, infested with insects, and so hard that it had to be soaked in water or beaten with hammers before it could be eaten. The process of preparing dried fish for consumption was disgusting and time-consuming. Vikings would have to scrape off mold and maggots, then soak the fish in whatever water they could spare. Even then, the result was often a mushy, foul-tasting substance that bore little resemblance to actual food. Many Vikings would gag while trying to eat it, but the alternative was starvation. Salted meat was another primary food source, but it came with its own problems. The salt used for preservation was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and other impurities that made the meat gritty and unpalatable. The meat itself would often spoil despite the salt, developing a rancid taste that would make modern people violently ill. During long voyages, salted meat would often become so hard that Vikings couldn't bite through it. They would have to use their knives to hack off small pieces, then chew them like leather until they were soft enough to swallow. The constant chewing would leave their jaws aching and their teeth worn down, but it was the only way to get any nutrition from their rations. Hardtack biscuits provided carbohydrates, but were notorious for becoming infested with weevils and other insects. Vikings would often have to eat these biscuits in the dark so they couldn't see the bugs crawling through their food. The biscuits would become so hard during voyages that they could break teeth, forcing Vikings to soak them in ale or water until they softened into a mushy paste. The psychological impact of eating infested food cannot be overstated. Vikings were proud warriors who valued strength and vitality, but they were forced to consume food that was crawling with insects and often partially rotted. This degradation of their most basic needs contributed to a sense of desperation and demoralization that affected the entire crew. Fresh water presented even more serious challenges than food. Vikings had to carry enough water for the entire crew for the duration of the voyage. But water was heavy and took up valuable space that could be used for other supplies. They would store water in wooden barrels or leather containers. But these storage methods led to serious problems with water quality. Water stored in wooden barrels would quickly become stagnant and develop a foul taste that made it barely drinkable. The wood would impart its own flavors to the water, and algae would begin to grow in the dark, warm conditions inside the barrels. After a few weeks, the water would smell like a swamp and taste even worse. Leather water containers presented different problems, but were equally unpalatable. The water would take on the taste of the leather and whatever substances had been used to treat it. It would often become contaminated with bacteria and other microorganisms that would cause illness among the crew. Vikings had no way to purify contaminated water, so they often had to choose between drinking foul water or dying of thirst. Rationing water required brutal discipline that tested the social bonds holding the crew together. Each man would receive a small portion of water each day, barely enough to sustain life. They would have to resist the temptation to drink their entire ration at once, saving some for later in the day when thirst became unbearable. The psychological torture of constant thirst was almost unbearable. Vikings would dream about fresh, clean water, fantasizing about springs and streams they had known on land. Some would become obsessed with water, thinking about it constantly and developing elaborate plans for what they would drink when they finally reached land. During storms, water rationing became even more critical because the physical exertion required to keep the ship afloat would increase everyone's thirst dramatically. Vikings would work for hours bailing water and managing sails while desperately craving the very substance they were trying to keep out of their ship. The irony was not lost on them that they were surrounded by water but couldn't drink any of it. Some desperate Vikings would try to drink seawater, but this would only make their situation worse. Seawater would cause violent illness and actually increase thirst rather than relieving it. Experienced Vikings would have to physically restrain their companions from drinking seawater, knowing that it would kill them faster than thirst alone. The combination of inadequate food and water created a state of chronic malnutrition that weakened Vikings physically and mentally. They would lose significant weight during long voyages, becoming gaunt shadows of their former selves. Their strength would diminish daily, making it increasingly difficult to perform the physical tasks necessary to keep the ship moving and on course. Malnutrition would also affect Vikings' mental capabilities, making them prone to poor judgment and irrational behavior. They would become irritable and quick to anger, leading to fights over food rations or perceived slights. The social structure that held Viking society together would begin to break down under the pressure of starvation. Some Vikings would resort to desperate measures to supplement their rations. They would try to catch fish using improvised hooks and lines, but this was extremely difficult from a moving ship and rarely successful. They would attempt to catch seabirds that landed on the rigging, but these birds were wary and difficult to capture. When Vikings did manage to catch fresh fish or birds, the excitement would be overwhelming. Fresh meat was such a rare treat that it would boost morale throughout the entire crew. However, these small supplements could never provide enough nutrition to significantly improve their overall condition. The discovery of spoiled food in their stores was a disaster that could doom the entire expedition. Vikings would open a barrel of salted meat only to find it completely rotten and inedible. This meant that their carefully calculated food supplies would have to be stretched even further, reducing everyone's rations and increasing the likelihood of starvation. Fights over food became increasingly common as voyages progressed and hunger intensified. Vikings would accuse each other of stealing rations or taking more than their fair share. These accusations could lead to violent confrontations that would split the crew into factions and make cooperation even more difficult. The hierarchy aboard. Viking ships would sometimes break down completely when food became scarce. Normally, leaders would eat first and receive the best portions, but desperate hunger could drive even loyal followers to challenge this system. Mutinies over food distribution were not uncommon, leading to bloodshed and chaos aboard ships that were already struggling to survive. Some Viking leaders would try to maintain discipline through increasingly harsh punishments for food theft or hoarding. They would threaten to throw offenders overboard or leave them behind at the next landing. But these threats became less effective as starvation made everyone desperate. The psychological impact of watching companions slowly starve to death was devastating for crew morale. Vikings would see their friends becoming weaker each day, losing weight and strength until they could no longer perform their duties. Eventually, some would simply lie down and refuse to get up, waiting for death to take them. The decision of whether to continue feeding Vikings who were too weak to work created moral dilemmas that tore crews apart. Some argued that food should only go to those who could contribute to the ship's operation, while others insisted that loyalty demanded they care for all crew members, regardless of their condition. When Vikings finally died of starvation, their bodies would be thrown overboard like those who died of disease. But starvation deaths were particularly demoralizing because they seemed so preventable if only they had brought more food or managed their supplies better. Survivors would be haunted by guilt, wondering if they could have done something different to save their companions. The constant hunger would affect every aspect of life aboard the ship. Vikings would become obsessed with food, talking about meals they had eaten in the past and planning elaborate feasts they would have when they returned home. These conversations would provide some psychological relief, but also intensify their current suffering by highlighting what they were missing. Some Vikings would develop eating disorders or food-related compulsions that would persist long after they returned to land. They would hoard food obsessively or eat enormous quantities when it was available, unable to trust that their next meal was secure. The psychological scars of starvation would follow them for the rest of their lives. The irony of dying from starvation while surrounded by the ocean's abundance was not lost on Vikings. They could see fish swimming around their ship and seabirds flying overhead, but they lacked the tools and knowledge to effectively harvest these resources. They were trapped in a desert of plenty, dying of thirst while surrounded by undrinkable water and starving while surrounded by uncatchable food. The desperation of starvation would drive some Vikings to unthinkable acts that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When all conventional food sources were exhausted and death seemed inevitable, crews would face the ultimate taboo that no warrior wanted to contemplate. Cannibalism became the final, horrific option that separated those who would do anything to survive from those who would rather die with their honor intact. The first discussions about eating human flesh would begin whispered in the darkest corners of the ship, spoken in hushed tones that barely carried over the sound of waves and wind. Vikings would glance nervously at their weakest companions, making calculations that reduced human beings to pounds of meat that could sustain the living for a few more days. These conversations would tear the crew apart psychologically long before any actual cannibalism occurred. Men who had fought side by side, shared their rations, and trusted each other with their lives suddenly became potential meals in each other's eyes. The social bonds that held Viking society together would begin to unravel as survival instinct overwhelmed cultural taboos. When the first crew member died of starvation, the remaining Vikings would face an impossible choice. They could throw the body overboard according to tradition and continue starving, or they could violate every moral principle they held sacred and consume their dead companion. The decision would split crews into factions, with some arguing for survival at any cost, while others insisted that death was preferable to such dishonor. The Vikings who chose cannibalism would discover that eating human flesh provided little relief from their suffering. The meat would be tough and unpalatable, requiring significant energy to digest that their weakened bodies could barely provide. The psychological trauma of consuming their friends would often cause violent illness that negated any nutritional benefit they might have gained. The smell of cooking human flesh would fill the ship with an odor that was unmistakably different from any animal meat. Vikings who participated in these grisly meals would never forget that smell, and it would haunt their dreams long after they returned to civilization. Many would develop permanent aversions to meat of any kind, unable to eat without remembering the taste of their dead companions. Those who refused to participate in cannibalism would watch in horror as their surviving crewmates descended into what they considered a form of madness. The act of eating human flesh would change people in fundamental ways, stripping away their humanity and turning them into something that other Vikings no longer recognized as fully human. The selection of which bodies to consume would create its own set of moral horrors. Would they eat the weakest who died first, or save those bodies and instead kill the strongest to provide more meat? These decisions would have to be made by men who were already half mad from starvation and psychological trauma, leading to choices that would seem incomprehensible to rational minds. Some Vikings would try to establish rules around cannibalism, attempting to maintain some semblance of civilization even while committing the ultimate taboo. They might decide that only those who died naturally could be consumed, or that certain parts of the body were off limits out of respect for the dead. But these rules would quickly break down as starvation intensified and desperation overwhelmed. Reason. The preparation of human flesh for consumption would require Vikings to butcher their former companions like animals, using the same knives they had used to cut fish or prepare game on land. The psychological disconnect required to see a friend's body as nothing more than meat would drive many Vikings to complete mental breakdown. Arguments over the distribution of human flesh would lead to violence that made previous fights over regular rations seem trivial. Vikings would literally fight to the death over pieces of their dead companions, abandoning all pretense of brotherhood or loyalty in their desperate hunger. These fights would further reduce the crew, providing more bodies for the survivors to consume in an endless cycle of horror. The guilt associated with cannibalism would be overwhelming for Vikings who survived these experiences. They would return home carrying the knowledge that they had violated the most fundamental taboos of their society, and many would be unable to reintegrate into normal life. Some would become hermits, unable to face the judgment of their communities, while others would develop severe mental illness that would plague them until death. Religious Vikings would believe that cannibalism had damned their souls and prevented them from entering Valhalla, even if they died gloriously in battle later. This spiritual despair would be almost as devastating as the physical trauma, leaving survivors feeling hopeless and disconnected from their gods and their culture. The secret of what happened during these desperate voyages would bind survivors together in a fellowship of shame that would last for the rest of their lives. They would recognize each other by the haunted look in their eyes and the way they recoiled from certain foods or smells. These men would often seek each other out, finding comfort only in the company of others who had shared their ultimate degradation. But even when Vikings managed to avoid the horror of cannibalism, the constant threat of starvation would fundamentally change their relationship with food and eating. They would develop obsessive behaviors around meals, hoarding food even when it was abundant, and eating with a desperate intensity that disturbed those who hadn't shared their experiences. The psychological scars of near starvation would manifest in nightmares that plagued Vikings for decades after their voyages. They would dream of empty food stores, of watching their companions waste away, of making impossible choices between survival and honor. These dreams would be so vivid and traumatic that many Vikings would avoid sleep, leading to chronic exhaustion and mental instability. Some Vikings who survived starvation voyages would develop what we now recognize as eating disorders, binging on enormous quantities of food when it was available, and then feeling overwhelming guilt and shame afterward. They would be unable to trust that their next meal was secure, leading to compulsive hoarding and anxiety around food that would affect their families and communities. The knowledge that they were capable of cannibalism would haunt even Vikings, who never actually participated in it. They would know that under the right circumstances, they too could abandon their humanity and consume their friends. This self-knowledge would create a deep sense of shame and self-doubt that would undermine their confidence and their sense of moral superiority. Veterans of starvation voyages would often become obsessed with food preparation and storage, developing elaborate systems for preserving and rationing supplies that seemed excessive to others. They would be unable to waste even the smallest scrap of food, seeing abundance as temporary and always preparing for the next famine. The social dynamics among Vikings who had survived cannibalism voyages would be permanently altered. They would be unable to look at each other without remembering what they had done or considered doing. Friendships would be strained by the knowledge of who had been willing to eat whom, and trust would be difficult to rebuild. Even after returning to safety, communities that welcomed back Vikings from starvation, voyages would often sense that something fundamental had changed about these men, even if they never learned the specific details of what had happened. The survivors would carry themselves differently, speak in hushed tones about their experiences, and show reactions to food and eating that marked them as different from other warriors. The ultimate irony of these starvation experiences was that Vikings who survived them often became more effective raiders and warriors. Having faced the absolute worst that life could offer and survived, they would approach battle with a fatalistic courage that made them incredibly dangerous opponents. They had already lost their souls during the voyage, so they had nothing left to fear from death or violence. Yet this effectiveness came at a terrible price that extended far beyond the individual. Vikings who had endured starvation, their families would struggle to understand why their returning warriors were changed, why they couldn't enjoy simple pleasures like family meals or celebrations. The trauma would ripple through Viking communities, affecting wives, children, and friends who had to live with men who had been fundamentally altered by their experiences. The medical understanding of starvation and its effects was virtually non-existent among Vikings, so communities had no framework for helping these traumatized warriors recover from their experiences. They were expected to simply return to normal life as if nothing had happened. But the psychological wounds they carried were often deeper and more lasting than any physical injury they might have sustained in battle. Some Vikings would try to cope with their trauma through alcohol, drinking enormous quantities of ale or mead in an attempt to forget their experiences or numb their emotional pain. This would often lead to violent behavior and social problems that would further isolate them from their communities and families. Others would throw themselves into religious practices with an intensity that bordered on obsession, desperately, seeking forgiveness for their actions or trying to prove their worthiness to enter the afterlife despite their violations of sacred taboos. These extreme religious behaviors would often alienate them from more moderate believers and create additional social problems. The children of Vikings who had survived cannibalism voyages would often grow up sensing that something was wrong with their fathers, even if they never learned the specific details of what had happened. These children might develop their own psychological problems, inheriting trauma that had been passed down through family dynamics and unexpressed emotions. Viking society as a whole would be affected by the presence of these traumatized survivors, though the full extent of the impact would never be openly acknowledged. The knowledge that even the bravest warriors could be reduced to cannibalism under the right circumstances would undermine confidence in Viking superiority and moral authority. The stories of starvation and cannibalism would become cautionary tales that were whispered among Vikings planning new voyages, serving as warnings about the importance of proper planning and preparation. However, these stories would also serve to glorify the survivors, portraying them as men who had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious, even if victory had come at an unthinkable cost. The legacy of these horrible experiences would influence Viking culture for generations, contributing to their reputation for ruthlessness and their willingness to commit acts that other cultures found incomprehensible. Having crossed the ultimate moral boundary during their voyages, Vikings would find it easier to commit atrocities during raids and conquests, but the starvation and potential cannibalism were just the final stages of a much longer process of psychological breakdown that began long before the food ran out. The mental toll of Viking voyages started from the moment the ship left shore and intensified with each passing day until even the strongest minds began to crack under the relentless pressure. The isolation from land and civilization was perhaps the most underestimated psychological challenge that Vikings faced during their voyages. Modern people who live in connected, populated environments can barely imagine what it feels like to be completely cut off from the rest of humanity, surrounded by endless ocean with no guarantee that land even exists in the direction they're traveling. The vastness of the ocean was psychologically overwhelming for Vikings who were accustomed to the familiar landscapes of Scandinavia. They would spend days or weeks seeing nothing but water in every direction, with no landmarks, no familiar sights, and no sense of progress toward their destination. This sensory deprivation would begin to affect their mental state within just a few days of leaving shore. The lack of variety in their environment would create a form of psychological torture that was impossible to escape. Every day would bring the same endless expanse of water, the same gray sky, the same monotonous routine of rowing and sailing. Vikings would begin to feel like they were trapped in a nightmare from which they could never wake up. The absence of women and families would create an additional layer of psychological stress that affected every aspect of shipboard life. Vikings were accustomed to the civilizing influence of female companionship and the comfort of family relationships. Trapped aboard a ship with only other men, they would become increasingly crude, violent, and unstable. As the voyage progressed, the all-male environment would intensify conflicts and eliminate the social moderating influences that normally kept Viking communities relatively peaceful, without wives, mothers, and daughters to serve as moral anchors. Vikings would descend into increasingly primitive behavior that would shock even their own standards of conduct. Sleep deprivation from the constant watch schedules and harsh conditions would compound all other psychological problems. The Vikings would endure days with only fragmented hours of sleep, never reaching the deep rest essential for mental health. This relentless exhaustion often led to hallucinations, paranoia, and violent outbursts that put the entire crew in danger. These sleep-deprived Vikings would experience hallucinations, seeing land where there was none, hearing phantom voices from the water, or perceiving threats that weren't real. These false visions would cause panic and confusion among crews already struggling to stay sane in impossible conditions. The constant noise on the ship meant the Vikings could never find the peace and quiet needed for mental recovery. The groaning of wood, the splashing waves, the wind in the rigging, and the voices of the crew created a deafening clamor that made rest and reflection impossible. This sensory overload would slowly wear down even the toughest minds. The lack of privacy meant Vikings had no chance to process their emotions or deal with psychological stress in a healthy way. They were forced to project an image of strength and confidence, even when they were terrified or despairing. Showing weakness could damage crew morale and their standing in the group. The uncertainty about their destination and the missions. Success created a constant anxiety that intensified throughout the journey. Vikings worried about their course, whether they'd find their target, if they would survive the return trip, and if their families were safe at home. These worries multiplied, becoming overwhelming sources of stress. Every Viking felt an enormous psychological burden for his companion's survival. They knew that a single mistake, a moment of weakness, or a failure to do their duty could mean death for everyone on board. This responsibility weighed heavily on men already fighting for their own survival. The gradual breakdown of social norms and civilized behavior was deeply unsettling for Vikings, who prided themselves on their cultural achievements. They watched themselves and their crewmates descend into increasingly savage behavior, losing the very qualities that set them apart from the people they saw as inferior. As the voyage wore on and psychological stress worsened, they developed superstitions and irrational beliefs. They began seeing omens in every cloud, every bird, every unusual wave. While these superstitions offered some comfort, They also increased anxiety as the Vikings constantly looked for signs of impending doom. The formation of factions and alliances within the crew created political tensions that added to the psychological strain. They would start to suspect each other of hoarding food, planning mutinies, or making secret deals. These suspicions bred an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust, making cooperation increasingly difficult. One of the most psychologically damaging parts of the experience was the slow realization they might not survive. Vikings who started the journey full of confidence would gradually accept that they were likely to die far from home, without glory or a proper burial, and without seeing their families again. The constant thought of death became a companion, affecting every decision and interaction. Vikings began saying their goodbyes, sharing their final thoughts, and making peace with their gods, even while desperately fighting for survival. This continuous preparation for death was emotionally draining and sapped their will to continue. Leadership structures fell apart as psychological stress overwhelmed the authority systems that typically governed Viking society. Captains and experienced sailors lost their ability to command respect as they also succumbed to the mental pressures of the voyage. This power vacuum led to chaos and confusion, making survival even harder. The loss of individual identity was a subtle but profound psychological change. Constantly surrounded by the same people, doing the same tasks, and facing the same challenges, they began to lose their sense of self. They became interchangeable parts of a survival machine rather than unique human beings with their own thoughts and feelings. Long before anyone died of starvation, the psychological preparation for potential cannibalism began. Vikings started looking at their companions differently, sizing up their body weight and their value to the group. These thoughts horrified them, but were impossible to suppress as hunger and desperation intensified. The guilt from these cannibalistic thoughts was almost as damaging as the act itself. They were ashamed of their own minds, disgusted by their ability to consider eating their friends, and terrified of what they were becoming. This self-loathing added another layer to their psychological suffering. The gradual dehumanization during these voyages prepared Vikings for the atrocities they would commit during raids. Having lost their own humanity on the journey, it was easier to deny the humanity of their victims when they finally reached their destination. But perhaps the most tragic part of this psychological breakdown was that it was mostly invisible to the Vikings themselves. They had no understanding of mental health, no words for psychological trauma, and no way to recognize when their minds were being damaged. They interpreted their symptoms as weakness, cowardice, or divine punishment, rather than as natural responses to impossible circumstances. The stigma attached to mental health issues in Viking society prevented warriors from seeking help or even admitting their symptoms. They were expected to remain strong and composed, and any sign of psychological weakness was seen as a character flaw, not an injury needing treatment and compassion. The long-term effects of this trauma followed the Vikings for the rest of their lives, impacting their relationships, their ability to function in society, and their overall mental health. Many never fully recovered, living as broken men who could never quite readjust to normal life on land. The families and communities that welcomed back these psychologically damaged warriors struggled to understand them. They saw men who looked familiar but acted like strangers, warriors who had lost their zest for life and their ability to form meaningful connections. The cycle of trauma continued as these damaged Vikings raised children who inherited their psychological wounds through family dynamics and learned behaviors. The effects of these brutal voyages rippled through Viking society for generations, creating a culture that was increasingly hardened, violent, and disconnected from normal human emotions. Despite all these psychological horrors, Vikings continued to undertake these voyages, driven by economic necessity, cultural expectations, and the slim hope of being among the lucky few who returned home wealthy and successful. They would convince themselves they were different and stronger, able to handle whatever the ocean threw at them. This self-deception was likely necessary for Vikings to function at all. If they truly understood the full extent of the physical and psychological trauma they were about to endure, most would never have left shore. The heroic stories about Viking voyages served to mask the brutal reality of these journeys. The survivors who did return often perpetuated these myths, either because they believed their suffering had been worthwhile or because they couldn't bear to admit the full extent of what they had endured. They would tell tales of glorious adventures and heroic deeds, carefully leaving out the details about starvation, disease, psychological breakdown, and cannibalism. But the truth about Viking Longship voyages was far more horrific than any romantic legend. These were journeys into hell itself, floating nightmares that tested the absolute limits of human endurance and often found those limits wanting. The men who survived were forever changed, carrying physical and psychological scars that would never heal. The legacy of these brutal voyages shaped Viking culture and European history in ways still felt today. The warriors who emerged from these floating torture chambers would go on to terrorize medieval Europe, bringing a level of violence and ruthlessness partly forged in the crucible of the ocean. Understanding the true nature of life on a Viking longship helps explain why these raiders were so feared and why their impact on history was so profound. They weren't just tough sailors. They were men who had been broken down and rebuilt by experiences so horrible that they had fundamentally altered their relationship with violence, death, and human suffering. The next time you see a romanticized portrayal of Viking voyages, remember the reality, the stench, the starvation, the disease, the psychological breakdown, and the unspeakable acts desperate men would commit to survive another day in their floating prison. These weren't glorious adventures. They were endurance contests against death, and the prize for winning wasn't glory or honor. It was simply the chance to see another sunrise, and if they were incredibly lucky, the chance to one day return home and tell others about the hell they had survived. The psychological scars would show up in countless ways that Vikings themselves barely understood. Men who had been confident leaders would return home unable to make simple decisions, paralyzed by the memory of choices that had led to their friends' deaths. They would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, reliving storms that had ended months earlier, feeling phantom waves crashing over them while lying safely in their own beds. Some Vikings became obsessed with always knowing where the nearest exit was, never wanting to feel trapped again. They'd refuse to enter small rooms, and the sound of creaking wood would send them into violent rages that terrified their families. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive at sea became a curse on land. Every unexpected sound would make them reach for weapons that weren't there. They'd constantly scan crowds for threats, unable to relax even in their own communities. Sleep became their enemy because it left them vulnerable to the nightmares that haunted their minds. Many Vikings turned to alcohol as their only escape. They'd drink themselves into a stupor night after night, seeking the temporary peace that only unconsciousness could provide. But even drunk, they'd sometimes wake up swinging at invisible enemies or crying out warnings about storms that only existed in their damaged minds. The relationships these men tried to maintain suffered tremendously. Wives found themselves married to strangers who looked like their husbands but acted like wild animals. Children learned to fear their own fathers, never knowing when a gentle touch might trigger a violent flashback. Sexual intimacy became nearly impossible for many veterans. The physical closeness that once brought comfort now felt like the cramped conditions of the longship, causing panic attacks and violent reactions. Their partners had to learn to approach them like dangerous animals, moving slowly and speaking softly to avoid setting off explosive reactions. The simple act of eating was forever changed. They would hoard food obsessively, hiding portions in secret places around their homes because they could never trust that their next meal was guaranteed. Family dinners became tense affairs where veterans ate with desperate intensity, as if every meal might be their last. Some Vikings developed aversions to certain foods that reminded them of their shipboard rations. The smell of dried fish would make them vomit uncontrollably. The sight of salted meat would trigger flashbacks so vivid they would temporarily lose touch with reality, believing they were back on the longship fighting for survival. The sound of rain on a roof would send many veterans into panic attacks, reminding them of storms that had nearly killed them. They would barricade themselves in their homes during bad weather, convinced the wind and rain would destroy everything they had rebuilt. Water itself became a source of terror for many who had survived near-drowning experiences. They would refuse to bathe properly, unable to tolerate the feeling of water on their skin without remembering the sensation of drowning. Rivers and lakes that had once provided recreation and sustenance became obstacles to be avoided. The veterans often sought each other's company, finding solace only among men who had shared similar experiences. They would gather in taverns, drinking and sharing stories no one else could understand or believe. These gatherings offered temporary relief, but also reinforced their isolation from society. Their conversations were filled with dark humor and casual references to death that disturbed other listeners. They would joke about things that should never be funny, laugh about experiences that should have broken them, and speak of human suffering with a detachment that made them fundamentally different from other people. The religious beliefs of these traumatized Vikings often underwent dramatic changes. Some became fanatically devoted to their gods, convinced that only divine intervention had saved them. They'd make elaborate offerings and perform rituals, desperately trying to ensure they never had to endure such suffering again. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in benevolent gods with the horrors they had experienced. They became bitter and cynical, mocking religious practices and challenging the spiritual beliefs that had once given their lives meaning. The skills that had kept them alive on the voyage became liabilities in peaceful society. Their ability to function on little sleep made them insomniacs. Their hyper-awareness of threats made them seem paranoid and unstable. Their capacity for violence, honed by months of fighting for survival, made them dangerous. A minor argument could escalate into deadly combat because these men had learned that hesitation meant death. They had to constantly restrain themselves from using the level of force that had been necessary on the LONGSHIP. The social hierarchy that governed their shipboard existence continued to influence their behavior long after returning home. They struggled with authority figures who hadn't shared their experiences, unable to respect leaders who they knew would have died on a longship. This created conflicts with local authorities and traditional power structures. Some veterans became obsessed with physical fitness, convinced their survival depended on their strength and endurance. They would train compulsively, pushing their bodies to extremes that worried their families. They never felt strong enough or prepared enough for the next crisis they were sure was coming. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming fatalistic and neglecting their health because they believed their survival had been pure luck. They stopped caring about their appearance, hygiene, or physical condition, convinced that nothing they did could influence their fate. The nightmares that plagued them were often so vivid they preferred to stay awake. They developed elaborate bedtime rituals to ward off bad dreams or simply refused to sleep until exhaustion forced unconsciousness upon them. When they did sleep, their partners learned to sleep lightly, ready to wake them from nightmares that could turn violent. Many Viking wives bore bruises from being struck by husbands who were fighting dream enemies. Some chose to sleep in separate beds or rooms to protect themselves. The guilt these veterans carried was overwhelming and persistent. They blamed themselves for every companion who had died, every decision that had led to suffering, every moment they had chosen their own survival over someone else's. This guilt ate at them like a disease, making them believe they didn't deserve the peace and prosperity they had found at home. Some tried to atone for their perceived sins through acts of charity or service. They'd give away their wealth, help others, or undertake dangerous missions that might allow them to die with honor. But nothing could truly cleanse them of the guilt they carried for simply being among survivors. The hypervigilance that had kept them alive made normal social interactions nearly impossible. They would constantly scan rooms for exits, see everyone they met as a potential threat, and interpret innocent gestures as signs of impending violence. This made them seem strange and dangerous. Their families learned to move slowly around them, speak softly, and avoid sudden movements that might trigger violent reactions. Children grew up walking on eggshells around fathers who might explode at any moment, creating a new generation of damaged individuals with their own psychological scars. The medical understanding of psychological trauma was so primitive that these men received no help for their invisible wounds. They were expected to simply get over their experiences and return to normal life. The idea that their minds might need healing just as much as their bodies was completely foreign to Viking culture. Some tried to self-medicate with herbs and potions, seeking anything to relieve their constant mental anguish, often making their problems worse through addiction. The isolation these veterans felt was profound and lasting. They felt disconnected from their families, their communities, and even their own identities. The men they had been before the voyages seemed like different people entirely, and they struggled to reconcile their past selves with who they had become. Many became wanderers, unable to settle in one place because staying still made them feel trapped and vulnerable. They moved from settlement to settlement, never finding peace. The impact on their children was devastating. Kids grew up with fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, men who could provide protection but not the love and stability children needed. These children often developed their own psychological problems, inheriting trauma they didn't even understand. Some veterans became obsessed with preparing for disasters that might never come. They'd stockpile food and weapons, plan escape routes, and train their families for emergencies that existed mainly in their damaged minds. Their homes became fortresses designed to protect against threats that were more psychological than real. The sexual dysfunction many veterans experienced put enormous strain on their marriages. The physical intimacy that should have provided comfort and connection instead triggered memories of the cramped, uncomfortable longship. Their partners felt rejected and confused, unable to understand why their touch caused pain instead of pleasure. Many developed eating disorders that persisted for years. They might binge eat when food was available, gorging themselves until they were sick because their bodies remembered starvation so vividly. Or they might restrict their eating, rationing food even when it was abundant because they couldn't trust the supply would continue. The sound of rain on a roof would send many into panic attacks, reminding them of storms that had nearly killed them. They would become agitated during windy weather, pacing their homes and checking their disaster preparations. Their families learned to dread windy days. Water itself became a source of terror for many who would refuse to bathe, unable to tolerate the feeling of water on their skin. Rivers and lakes that had once been sources of recreation became obstacles to be avoided. The veterans would often seek out each other's company, finding solace only among men who had shared similar experiences. They'd gather in taverns, drinking and sharing stories no one else could understand. These gatherings offered temporary relief, but also reinforced their isolation from society. Their conversations were filled with dark humor and casual references to death that disturbed others. They would joke about things that should never be funny, laugh about experiences that should have broken them completely, and speak of human suffering with a detachment that marked them as fundamentally different. The religious beliefs of these traumatized Vikings often underwent dramatic changes. Some became fanatically devoted to their gods, convinced only divine intervention had saved them. They'd make elaborate offerings and perform rituals, desperately trying to ensure they never had to endure such suffering again. Others lost their faith entirely, unable to reconcile their belief in benevolent gods with the horrors they had experienced. They became bitter and cynical, mocking religious practices and challenging the faith that had once given their lives. Meaning, the skills that had kept them alive became liabilities in peaceful society. Their ability to function on little sleep made them insomniacs who paced their homes all night. Their hyper-awareness of threats made them seem paranoid and unstable to neighbors. Their capacity for violence, honed by months of fighting for survival, made them dangerous. A minor argument could escalate into deadly combat because these men had learned that hesitation meant death. They had to constantly restrain themselves from using the level of force necessary on the LONGSAIP. The social hierarchy from their shipboard. Existence continued to influence their behavior long after returning home. They struggled with authority figures who hadn't shared their experiences, unable to respect leaders they knew would have died on a longship. This created conflicts with local authorities. Some veterans became obsessed with physical fitness, convinced their survival had depended on their strength. They'd train compulsively, pushing their bodies to extremes. They never felt strong enough or prepared enough for the next crisis. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming fatalistic and neglecting their health because they believed their survival had been pure luck. The nightmares that plagued them were often so vivid they'd prefer to stay awake. When they did sleep, their partners learned to sleep lightly, ready to wake them from nightmares that could turn violent. Many wives bore bruises from being struck by husbands fighting dream enemies. The guilt these veterans carried was overwhelming. They blamed themselves for every companion who had died. This guilt ate at them, making them believe they didn't deserve peace at home. Some tried to atone through charity, but nothing could truly cleanse them of the guilt they carried for being among the survivors. The hypervigilance made normal social interactions nearly impossible. They'd constantly scan rooms for exits and see every person as a potential threat. Their families learned to move slowly around them and avoid sudden movements. Children grew up on eggshells, creating a new generation with their own psychological scars. The lack of medical understanding meant these men received no help for their invisible wounds. They were expected to simply get over their experiences. Some tried to self-medicate with herbs, often making their problems worse through addiction. The isolation these veterans felt was profound and lasting. They felt disconnected from their families, their communities, and their own identities. Many became wanderers, unable to settle because staying still made them feel trapped. The impact on their children was devastating. They grew up with emotionally absent fathers. Some veterans became obsessed with preparing for disasters that might never come. Their homes became fortresses. The sexual dysfunction many veterans experienced put enormous strain on their marriages. The physical intimacy that should have provided comfort instead triggered memories of the cramped longship. Many developed eating disorders, either binging or restricting food. The sound of wind forever reminded them of storms. They would become agitated during windy weather, The veterans who had survived the worst voyages were often unable to form new friendships, feeling that no one could understand what they had been through. They would become religious fanatics or completely secular, their faith transformed by their experiences. The physical disabilities many veterans carried served as constant reminders of their trauma. Their relationship with the ocean was forever changed. They would avoid coastal areas and boats. The hyperarousal that had kept them alive made peaceful environments feel wrong. They were constantly on edge. Many developed obsessive compulsive behaviors related to their survival. Their social skills were damaged. They struggled with conversation, speaking in short, urgent sentences. Their sense of time was distorted. The nightmares were so realistic they'd wake up disoriented, unsure of where they were. Some developed agoraphobia or claustrophobia. The trust issues that developed on the voyage affected every relationship they tried to maintain. Their communication skills were permanently altered. They became obsessed with weather patterns. The simple pleasure of a warm bed was never taken for granted again. Their appetite for risk was permanently altered. The bonds they had with fellow survivors were stronger than any other relationships, but also sources of pain. Their perspective on death was forever changed. They faced death without flinching. Their physical strength often declined rapidly after their return. The constant stress took a toll, aging them prematurely. Many developed chronic pain. Their sleep patterns never returned to normal. The anniversary dates of their voyages became periods of intense distress. Some became compulsive storytellers, needing others to understand what they had been through. Others became completely silent. The survival skills they had developed were often inappropriate for peaceful life. Their relationship with authority was forever changed. The camaraderie they had experienced was impossible to replicate. Their sense of purpose was profoundly affected. But most tragically, these psychological wounds were invisible to everyone, including themselves. Viking culture had no framework for understanding mental health problems, so these men suffered in silence. The true cost of Viking voyages wasn't just measured in lives lost during the journeys, but in the decades of suffering that followed. The normalization of trauma contributed to the legendary ruthlessness of Viking warriors, but it also created a society less capable of peace and connection. The romantic myths would persist because the truth was too horrible to accept. Understanding this psychological dimension is crucial to understanding Viking civilization. They weren't just tough guys. They were men forged in a crucible of suffering. Next phase of their ordeal was just beginning. As their battered longship finally approached their destination, the Vikings faced a new set of challenges that would test everything they had learned. The sight of land should have brought relief, but instead, it marked the start of an entirely new phase of brutality that would push their already damaged minds even further toward a complete breakdown. After months of floating hell, Vikings now faced combat while their bodies were weakened by malnutrition, their minds shattered by trauma, and their equipment corroded by salt water. The transition from sea to land warfare was jarring. Their legs would be unsteady after months of balancing on a moving deck, making them clumsy and vulnerable. Their weapons and armor would often fail at the worst possible moments, weakened by constant exposure to salt air. Their physical condition was drastically compromised, with slower reflexes, diminished strength, and limited endurance. The psychological state of these Vikings made them either exceptionally dangerous or completely ineffective. Some channeled their trauma into berserker-like fury, while others froze up completely. Hypervigilance made some incredibly effective in battle, but made others paranoid. Sleep deprivation affected their judgment and reaction time. The social bonds that had been strained during the voyage often collapsed completely during combat preparation. Arguments that had been simmering for months would finally explode into violence. These internal conflicts weakened raiding parties. The leadership structures often crumbled when faced with tactical decisions. The logistics of moving from sea to land operations created additional complications. Unloading heavy equipment and securing ships left them vulnerable. Finding fresh water and food was a desperate priority that made them reckless. The medical condition of many made them liabilities. Some suffered from scurvy or infected wounds, slowing down the entire party. The psychological impact of transitioning from victims at sea to aggressors on land was profound. Some overcompensated for their helplessness by becoming excessively violent, taking out months of pent-up frustration on innocent victims. Others were unable to summon the necessary aggression, their spirits broken by trauma. The coordination required for effective raiding was nearly impossible for groups of traumatized, exhausted men. Communication was hampered by psychological damage. Orders were misunderstood and tactical plans fell apart. The element of surprise was often lost due to the raiders' poor condition. The intimidation factor was diminished when local populations saw the actual state of the raiders, encouraging resistance. The sexual violence that often accompanied Viking raids took on an even more disturbing character when perpetrated by men who had been psychologically damaged. Their treatment of prisoners was affected by the dehumanization they had experienced. They had little difficulty viewing enemy populations as less than human. The decision-making processes were compromised by the mental state of the leaders. Captains on the edge of sanity would make irrational decisions. The physical demands of raiding were overwhelming for men already weakened. The psychological preparation for violence was complicated by the trauma they had already endured. Some couldn't distinguish between past and present trauma. The loot often proved disappointing, leading to frustration and additional violence. The division of spoils created new conflicts. The capture and management of slaves were complicated by the mental state of the traumatized warriors. The logistics of loading plundered goods were hampered by the raiders' poor physical condition. The return voyage presented additional psychological challenges. The combination of pre-existing mental damage and fresh wounds from violence was toxic. Some Vikings became obsessed with the violence they had committed, while others tried to suppress the memories. The religious implications of their actions weighed heavily on those who had turned to faith. The contrast between their helplessness at sea and their brutality on land created cognitive dissonance they couldn't resolve. The social dynamics within raiding parties were permanently altered. The reputation these damaged warriors built was based on their unpredictability and psychological instability. The cultural impact of these traumatized raiders extended far beyond their military actions. The normalization of extreme trauma became part of Viking culture. The economic success of raids was often overshadowed by the human cost. The strategic implications of fielding armies of traumatized warriors became apparent. These men were capable of extreme violence, but also unreliable. Military leaders had to develop new tactics. The technological innovations Vikings developed were often driven by the limitations imposed by their psychological condition. Intelligence gathering was complicated by the mental state of scouts. The seasonal timing of raids was influenced by the psychological cycles of the warriors. The training of new warriors was complicated by the example set by the veterans. The diplomatic relationships Vikings maintained were affected by their reputation. The internal politics of Viking communities were shaped by the presence of large numbers of traumatized veterans. The religious and cultural practices of Viking society evolved to accommodate the psychological needs of the warriors. Artistic and literary expressions reflected the psychological reality of the voyages. The legal systems had to adapt to deal with the problems created by traumatized individuals. The economic structures were shaped by the wealth from raids and the costs of supporting the damaged veterans. The military innovation spread, but so did awareness of the psychological costs. The legacy of these traumatized raiders would extend far beyond the medieval period. The Romantic myths were a psychological defense mechanism. The historical records often focused on military outcomes, ignoring the psychological dimensions. Archaeological evidence hinted at the human cost. The genetic legacy included the subtle impacts of trauma. The medical understanding of trauma remained primitive for centuries. The social evolution of Europe was influenced by the presence of these traumatized populations. The technological and tactical innovation spread, but the trauma that inspired them remained hidden. The cultural values were shaped by the need to provide frameworks to help traumatized warriors find meaning. Religious and philosophical traditions reflected the attempt to make sense of suffering. Storytelling served a crucial psychological function. Artistic achievements were motivated by the need to create beauty in the face of chaos. The expansion patterns were influenced by the psychological needs of traumatized populations seeking new environments. Trade relationships were affected by the reputation of the raiders and the needs of communities integrating the damaged veterans. The linguistic evolution of Norse languages was influenced by the need to describe traumatic experiences. The educational systems had to address the psychological realities of the culture. Family structures evolved and children practices adapted. The gender roles were influenced by the psychological damage inflicted on men. The seasonal rhythms were affected by the psychological cycles of the veterans. Agricultural and pastoral practices provided meaningful work. Craftsmanship traditions were partly motivated by the psychological need to create something lasting. Funeral and burial practices reflected their intimate familiarity with death. Coming-of-age ceremonies had to prepare young people for the psychological realities. The healing traditions gradually evolved to address psychological as well as physical ailments. The leadership structures had to manage populations of psychologically volatile veterans. The justice systems had to deal with traumatized individuals. Architectural traditions created spaces that provided security and comfort. Food culture was influenced by eating disorders and nutritional anxieties. Textile and clothing traditions reflected the need for comfort and protection. Musical traditions served psychological functions. Dance and movement traditions provided physical outlets for psychological tension. Storytelling and oral history served crucial psychological functions. But the most tragic aspect was how the cycle perpetuated itself, creating a culture hardened to violence. The normalization of trauma became so complete that Viking society eventually lost the ability to distinguish between necessary hardship and unnecessary brutality. The children who grew up in these communities internalized these patterns. The Romantic myths served as a psychological defense mechanism. The legends preserved the glory while editing out the horror. Understanding the true psychological reality of Viking voyages is essential for comprehending not just medieval history, but the broader patterns of how human societies cope with collective trauma. The Vikings were not uniquely brutal, but they provide a clear example of how extreme circumstances can transform individuals and entire cultures. The lessons of Viking psychological trauma remain relevant today. The true legacy of Viking voyages lies in their demonstration of both human resilience and human fragility. The next phase of their ordeal would test these shattered men in ways that would make their previous suffering seem almost bearable, as they faced the prospect of returning home to communities and families who could never truly understand what they had become during their months in floating hell.